This is Never Close the Inquiry with Nick Hagan. Welcome to Never Close the Inquiry, where I aim to demystify the right for the left and the left for the right. Where if you come as a conservative, I want you to leave knowing a little bit more about liberals. And if you come as a liberal, I want you to leave knowing a little bit more about conservatives. With the whole idea that over time we'll create better conversations, better relationships, better arguments, and maybe 80 or 90 more steps down the road, a better country. Ben Connelly, okay, of Carrying the Fire and a number of other publications. How's it going?
It's going well. It's going well. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, hey, very glad to have you. Very glad to learn. For those listening, just before we came on, so it turns out w- you're in Charlottesville right now. You live in Charlottesville. You went to the University of
Yes.
Virginia for undergrad. That's where I
Yeah,
went for law school. One of the best towns in America.
absolutely.
Yeah, yeah, man, love Charlotte. Do you have a favorite restaurant?
Milan Indian cuisine.
Duly noted. Okay, I don't remember that. I gotta go back. I was there was my yeah, we're gonna include this. My mom and I one time we were there. We I don't know, we ended up coming up with some sort of name for it. We went to Citizen Burger. You get
Hmm.
the Citizen Burger and you get the full combo. You eat the burger, the fries, the pickle, and then you go right across the way across the mall. And I don't remember the name of the donut place. There's a donut and ice cream place, but you eat ice cream on top of a donut
Yeah,
and
I
you
know what
do
you're
those.
talking
Yeah, you do those back to back. I don't recommend it, and
about.
I recognize you're doing some personal training now. Yeah. Anyway, so I wanted to have you on because I think you are a highly articulate exponent for traditional conservatism, and I wanted listeners to get a sense of what that is, why that still matters. At a time when the Republican Party is really in flux, and I want I want readers or sorry, listeners on both the right and the left to get that because I do have, I think, a split audience. Certainly trying to have a split audience and hope
Hmm.
to retain a split audience. Um, so first off, this is going to sound like a funny kind of first question, but you write that this newsletter, Carrying the Fire, you write under a pseudonym.
Yes.
What is that pseudonym, and how did you pick it?
The pseudonym is John Grady Atreides, and it's an amalgamation of um, John Grady Cole from Cormac McCarthy's All the Pretty Horses, and also House Atreides from Dune, from the Dune novels. Um, some of my favorite books, Cormac McCarthy being my favorite author. The term "carrying the fire" is a reference to another novel by Cormac McCarthy, The Road,
Hmm.
um, and the theme in The Road of carrying the fire of civilization. And that captures some of what I hope to do with the publication is sort of preserve um, something that only there's a uh, diminishing minority, I would say, of folks who um, see the world the way that I do, and
Hmm.
increasingly the right is dominated um, by populism and by deference to really whatever Donald Trump happens to think at any given time. And so I had to pick something. I originally had just launched it under my own name, and having two separate Substacks,
Hmm.
that was confusing because I had two separate profiles, and I had to have some way of distinguishing. Um, so that's how I came up with the name.
Nice. Okay, and so I mean, on Carrying the Fire, you write about. Would you? Is it fair to define it as traditional conservatism?
Yes, I would say
Okay.
yes. It is. Um, the There would be people who would dispute that definition, um, but uh, you know, there's lots of contentious debates over labels and who
Mhm.
counts as what. But if by traditional conservative you mean Ronald Reagan, William F. Buckley, um, the Republican Party of, say, 40, 45 years ago, then yes, you know that's what we're talking about.
Okay. And we are going to you do have a very helpful about page on your newsletter, and we're going to walk through 14 points you identify that I think, comprise traditional conservatism. Uh, but before we do that, and that will give people a I think a standing point from which to disagree with your definition.
Sure.
Um, but before we do that, how did you become a conservative, traditional or otherwise?
I would say I always been, as long as I knew about politics. I was my father taught American politics at university.
Mm,
Um, he was conservative, and certainly inherited a lot from him. Um, and I was coming of age around. The Bush presidency, and in hindsight, I definitely have my criticisms of Bush, but there were there was a lot that I really admire about the America of that era, um,
mhm.
in that there was, yes, things were contentious, but compared to today, there was a lot of patriotism and a lot of good faith understanding, that on both sides, that we were all Americans, and um, that despite our contentious disagreements, we weren't enemies.
Mm,
And I think race relations were better during that era too. A lot has changed in the last 10 years, for the worse, I think. And so, over the years, I in some areas became more libertarian,
mhm.
and in other areas, sort of I've always been a Christian. In other areas, I deepened my faith, and went deeper into studying the Bible and um, various theologians, and so that informed how some of my views shifted over time as well.
Interesting. When you say I have 2 questions from that. So, when you say that some of your views shifted more towards libertarianism over time, do you have an example?
Um, uh, sure. One example would be. Well, the classic libertarian example would be the legalization of drugs.
Mm,
Um, I've never been someone who had any interest in doing drugs, and I generally think that they're harmful for people. Um, I've never tried any drugs, but I came to see that the drug war failed, and I think it was um, counterproductive. I think it caused more destruction than it prevented in a lot of people's lives. And the case for the prohibition on illegal drugs was certainly hurt, I think, by the opioid epidemic, which
mm,
it's this was what our um, the reason we have an FDA, the reason we have laws against heroin. This was what was supposed to not happen, and people trusted their doctors, and they trusted the regulators that OxyContin was safe. And
mhm.
so it's not that I think that legalizing drugs would necessarily be a good thing, so much as that I think that um, it's the least worst option.
Interesting. That's yeah, that very, very interesting. When you were in college, so you're at the University of Virginia, you're from Virginia, your father is is it professor at Washington Lee or another?
Yes, Washington
Okay,
Lee.
a great school there in Virginia. Uh, did you find that your views were popular? How were they accepted on campus? Were you able to discuss them freely?
Yes, absolutely. I was able to discuss them freely. I would say, no, they were not popular. I wasn't alone either.
Mhm.
But the majority of people were generally um, center left, or further to the left. And the what I found, generally speaking, is that if you treat people right, and if you're willing to, um, disagree in good faith, and when you're having an argument with someone, if you can try to demonstrate to them that, even though you have a strong disagreement on matters that touch on some of the most important questions in our lives,
Mhm.
but that you still respect them, and that you aren't willing to, let this disagreement end your relationship. A lot of people will respect that, and um, I've had uh, very deep and bitter arguments with people with whom I remained friends. Um,
Yeah.
and so I'd say a lot of people were fairly tolerant. Also, with it being a public university, you're going to get a bigger cross section. Um, and so there was, I would say, le- there was a lot less craziness that, from the outside looking in on college campuses, you hear about all kinds of crazy things that go on. But a lot of people are, um, sort of normal kids. They're there to, get an education. They want to have fun too. But they don't really want to be activists.
Yeah. When you were in college, would you have self-identified as a Republican?
Yes, in fact, I distinctly remember one of the last times I self-identified as Republican was about 10 years ago, because what happened next was that, Donald Trump came down the escalator. And since that time, I've generally not identified myself as a Republican. I still often vote Republican, or sometimes I vote in Republican primaries. I voted for Nikki Haley in the 2024 Republican primary.
Mhm.
Um, and I don't. I also never identified as. I think there was a brief minute there where I identified as never Trump, and then after that, I stopped identifying as that either.
Mm.
There's still, uh, in part because I don't see my view as simply being in opposition to or in favor of one man. I think it's in some ways sort of odd that we have this one figure who has so changed our politics to the point that most of our discussions seem to be about him
Mhm.
rather than about particular issues. And so I had disagreements with the Republican Party. At the same time, we live in a two-party system. I don't see that changing anytime soon.
Mm.
There was a while where I would have loved to see a stronger third party, but the Democratic and Republican parties are essentially written into election law.
Yeah.
They're not going anywhere, and so what we really need is to have two sane parties. And so I'm not really a Republican, but I sort of still am, in the sense that, I want to see the Republican Party reformed in the right direction. And I don't think that happens if um, sane, non MAGA people leave the party.
Yeah. Let and so I think that that sets up your newsletter, but last thing before we get to that, and I said I want to read a section from this from your about description because I think it's very good and really kind of um, clearly explicates your motivation for doing this. But before we get to that, a final thing, you wrote a very good article, I think, on the importance of clarity in writing, and I think if you could provide a quick summary of that, of clarity and why it matters, I think that'd be great.
Sure. So that I wrote for my other Substack, Hardyhood Books, which is my original Substack. And it's not simply meant to be that essay in particular is not simply meant to be political. It really is about clarity in writing. Some of the examples I use touch on politics, um, but uh, I draw heavily on George Orwell's Politics in the English Language um, in it, and the the overall idea is that um, one of the major problems with our debates today is that both that writers themselves who are arguing, those themselves who are arguing about issues are unclear on exactly what it is that they are saying, and that many audiences are too. So
Mm,
10,000 readers may read, an article, and among them, they're not all reading the same thing.
Right.
They don't all see the same words. They see the same words, but they don't all understand the same thing from them. Um, and in many cases, it results from in some cases, sloppy writing. In some
Yeah.
cases, you have to really, as a writer, try hard to um, get your meaning across in a way that is intelligible to the reader. And in some cases, if you don't fully understand the history of your ideas or the opposing arguments or um, how the implications of different ideas and how different arguments work together, then there are going to be um, muddy areas or gray areas within your writing, and that's going to confuse your readers even more.
Yeah. It was nice to see the article. I think it's written very well, and it was also gratifying because it's something that I believe too. A lawyer, so it's when you come from legal practice, see in lawyers care a lot about definitions, and they care about them for a very good reason. And if you take, a transactional document, I was a restructuring lawyer, and you take a plan of reorganization, and maybe it's 230 pages long, and of those 230 pages, you might have 100 that are literally just definitions. And those definitions are negotiated so carefully and at such great length. And they really are, the definitions become almost the meat of the document. And I think, that's an extreme version, but I think there's something to be said for that. I think that kind of, plays that way in practice. It's amazing in the context of a political debate what you can resolve by being very clear about what you mean, and by
Mhm.
understanding very clearly what your opponent means. Uh, you know, Differences remain, but often they vanish to some extent, and what remains can be worked with or around. Um, so let me go to this. I am going to read your writing. You start out your about. This is when did you start this, by the way?
I started carrying the fire just a few months ago.
Well, it's terrific. So you start why this newsletter. Okay, and this is a few paragraphs. So listeners, bear in mind, you're about to deal with my voice for a little bit. With a populist president in office and a chorus of voices on all sides clamoring for nationalism or progressivism or post liberalism, it would seem that the cause of traditional or fusionist conservatism is on the back foot. While the American Enterprise Institute, National Review, Commentary, The Dispatch, and a handful of others carry on the work of defending a free and virtuous society while upholding the American project, it is dismaying how many forces there seemingly are arrayed against that work. Especially here on Substack, the majority of the discourse is given over to the progressive left or the MAGA right. I think that's probably also true on X, and yeah, it's just kind of a little bit true across the board. It remains my belief that there are more traditionally conservative voters in America who are unhappy with the status quo than we have been led to believe. It is also my view that this number is shrinking, beset as it is by the narrative that the 2024 election has ushered in a new era in which populist nationalism has displaced three legged stool conservatism for good. It is further my view that the majority of American citizens are potentially persuadable, not in the short term nor in the medium term, but in the very long term, both towards and away from the principles I hold dear. Moreover, much about the current moment is deeply dismaying. This is not the country in which I grew up, and though I love my country, I believe that we have been corrupted over the past decade, and that this corruption will only continue if it is not arrested. In light of that, I decided that remaining silent only affirmed the status quo and allowed the forces I believe to be pernicious to succeed in convincing people they are ascendant. If I believe, as I do, that more people need to do something to push back against dangerous cultural and political trends, then logically it is my responsibility to do something, however small. I have no talent. Well, we don't, we'll see if we agree with this sense. I have no talent for political organizing or for politicking or for campaigning, maybe, but I can write. That I do agree with. That is something I can do. Perhaps in a better world, there would be no need for a project like this. I wish we lived in that world, but we do not. Okay. And then you go on, Carrying the Fire is dedicated to defending the principles of American conservatism, which George Will rightly described as the project of conserving the American founding. In a world of actors seeking to destroy and uproot, conservatism, rightly understood, preserves and protects that which is good. Since there is some confusion about the meaning of American conservatism today, and even about what it means to be right or left, the following list elaborates on what this newsletter exists to preserve and defend. It's a non exhaustive list, but I do want to run through these points because truthfully, as someone who comes at this not as a traditional conservative, it's helpful for me to understand, and I think that's certainly going to be a true for a lot of listeners on the left and plenty on the right as well. So, first off, do you have anything you want to add to that really terrific intro you wrote a few months ago?
No, I don't. Thank you.
Perfect. Okay, so let's start. First principle that you mentioned, and by the way, is there any meaning to the order of these?
No, there isn't.
Okay, so no meaning to the order. So don't take them as this is not a list of priorities. This is just a list. Okay, first one, free enterprise. Thoughts on free enterprise?
Sure. So, free enterprise, also known as free market capitalism, is the economic system that was elaborated by Adam Smith in The Wealth of Nations. The term free enterprise is uh, often preferred by um, those who support free markets. Over a term like capitalism, in part because capitalism does tend to carry a negative connotation with people.
Hmm.
Um, uh, the term capitalism was coined by Marxists. I believe that's correct. I can't say exactly who coined it, but from what I've always read, um, that's who coined it. And does contain within it, that label contains within it the idea that the owners of capital um, uh, use the system to benefit them. And the
Mm,
term free enterprise is meant to indicate that no, the backbone of this system is um, not a tension between capital and labor, but rather a Adam Smith called it the system of natural liberty. He meant the idea that when you give people the space in which to build and create, they will launch enterprises either by themselves or together with other people. Enterprises, businesses,
mhm,
and they will use this to make the world a better place, to make themselves better off by making other people better off by creating um, products, goods and services that benefit other people, and by benefiting other people, so each of us um, becomes better off. This vision is a vision of a system that's positive sum, a world that isn't zero sum, a world in which free exchange allows all of us to prosper and to do better.
okay. I have a couple of questions from that. So first, from what it sounds like, given the last couple of sentences, you would not be pro tariff. Do I have that right?
That's correct.
Okay.
I support free trade.
Okay. Free trade. Okay. Free trade without exception, or free trade under some or most circumstances?
Um, I would say free trade under almost all circumstances, with the exception of um, current law, and going back for a very long time, has always barred products that were made with slave labor.
Mm,
So there are human rights exceptions. Um, and the other big, exception would be on matters of defense. We don't allow Lockheed Martin to sell missiles to the Chinese or the Russians, and that makes total sense to most people.
all right. Yep. Okay. Fair enough. Let's take a company like Purdue Pharma. So talking about free enterprise, kind of the backbone of it is people, they're entering into business and they're doing it for their own benefit, but also for the benefit of others. But then we have what seems like a clear counterexample with Purdue Pharma and a number of companies who have done similar things, both in that field and others, where they get rich, but there's a clear deleterious impact on individual people or society as a whole. What yeah, what's the response to that?
Right. And I would say I agree with you. I don't uh, I don't defend the actions of Purdue Pharma. The idea isn't simply that everyone will exercise their liberty virtuously. Later on in the list we'll get to that not everything that
Mm,
you're allowed to do is something that's good to do.
mm,
um, in the case of Purdue Pharma, I would say that the many people would like to believe that the purpose of the government is to protect us from bad actors like Purdue Pharma from harming people. um, and unfortunately, in the case of Purdue Pharma, that didn't happen. That
yeah.
didn't work. The opposite, in fact, happened. Um, it was um, rather than the idea of having a Food and Drug Administration that ensures that our drugs are safe, is that they will be honest with us and that they will catch bad actors such as the Sackler family
Hmm.
in the case of Purdue Pharma, and that didn't happen. And I would say that um, that actually there is more agreement, I think, than progressives and libertarians and conservatives sometimes seem to think on the subject of collusion between business and government. um,
Mm,
we're all against it,
yeah.
uh,
Right.
but we just have different priors about what is the best way to prevent it. Um, and in the case of Purdue Pharma, I see a company that has benefited a lot from subsidies from laws that are written to keep out competitors and from regulations that are crafted essentially to um, give them the position that they were in.
Yeah.
Um, and the drug market is not a free market. It's a highly regulated market, and unfortunately, it is not regulated in the way that the proponents of regulation often wish. It's regulated in a way that benefits the incumbents, like Purdue Pharma.
So, a couple of follow-up questions here. So, when you talk about the drug market not being a free market, what do you mean?
I mean that it is so highly regulated and so subsidized that um, large corporations are essentially protected from competition, and they're protected also from the consequences of their mistakes.
Mm,
So Purdue Pharma is still in business, right? Everybody knows what they did. Um, and yes, they did, in fact, um, uh, there have been lawsuits, there have been damages awarded to um, some victims, but there hasn't been the kind of consequences to them that I think would occur in a system in which they didn't benefit from some of these um, uh, constraints.
yeah, that's interesting. As a bankruptcy lawyer, yeah, so they did have to file for bankruptcy. I actually I knew very well the judge that oversaw the case. Did have to
Right,
file for bankruptcy. And that has been held up for years because they reached a settlement with the Sackler family. They moved all these billions overseas. They said we're going to give some of it back. Bankruptcy judge approves the settlement, ends up going up to the Supreme Court. They say no, you can't do that because of certain releases that were provided in the plan of reorganization, and
right.
now it's goes back down. Still, so that creditors have not yet received any money. They should in the relatively near future, and then Purdue will is the plan is for them to operate as a company for the public benefit. So they will not be doing what they did before.
Okay, good.
Exactly.
I stand corrected. I
Well,
stand corrected.
it's yeah, but I would say, but kind of to your point, there are plenty of other, and I say this as a former outside counsel for pharmaceutical companies. There are plenty of companies that did not do. They were not Purdue. They were not, maybe not bad actors in the same way, but certainly made money following in the wake of what Purdue did, and I have not been subject to, I think, some of the consequences that people would like. I
Right,
think would be a fair thing to say.
right, and then the other part of it was sort of what is in place before we get to the
Yeah.
opioid crisis. That's in part what I mean by Purdue Pharma, benefited from a system that is um, constrained in ways that protect them from competition and uh, allow them to have more power than I think they would in a more purely competitive market.
Interesting. Okay, so I think, yeah, the reason I'm staying on this point for a second is because I think the question that you'll get from the left a lot on something like this, it's like that, the concept of free enterprise, that sounds great, and you will find a lot of people that would on the left that, well, certainly the majority of people on the American left will self-identify as capitalists to some extent or fans of free enterprise, but they are, whether you call it a reaction or an overreaction, there's some sort of reaction to bad things that have done by companies with or without the imprimatur of the government. And there's a feeling that through regulation or through, thoughtful laws, we can prevent those things from happening. And what it sounds like you're saying is that often you're not going to prevent those things from happening and you might make it worse.
Right.
Okay. Yeah, that's tough. Do you and so you have the general principle there, and the Purdue Pharma, happen to bring it up. That's a difficult, kind of a difficult example. But when you have that general principle, how comfortable are you? Like, how doctrinaire are you? How comfortable are you making exceptions from? Like, are there industries where the approach is going to be a little different? Uh, yeah, how flexible do you think the
Um,
government should be?
right. Sure. So I would say that that is a question that's going to differ wildly as to it within the traditional Reaganite conservative.
Yeah.
Um, it's still going to differ widely on the person. I do tend to take a more libertarian view most of the time. The obvious market in which you're never going to have a purely free market would be defense. In
Mm,
that defense is largely, not exclusively, it's largely a monopsony where
yeah.
there's one buyer.
Yeah, kinda hope. Yeah. Yeah,
Technically, you can say the government will approve our defense contractors to sell some equipment to a foreign ally.
yeah,
So in that sense, it's not totally a monopsony, but it, for all intents and
close.
purposes, it is a monopsony. And so within that industry, there's never going to be perfect competition, and they're also, because we're um, rightly afraid of some of the consequences that could happen if we had no regulation in the defense market, or if we, in some cases, we have to make choices to prop up certain companies who and not let them fully experience the consequences of their actions, because of the fear that if enough defense companies went out of business, um, we wouldn't be able to field enough ships in some sort of
Sure.
naval war,
Yeah,
or we wouldn't be able to replenish our supplies.
yeah. Okay. Let's move on to the next one. Individual liberty and natural rights. And I'll read your little blurb here. It says, "It is morally right that human beings should own their own property and labor and be left alone to order their lives as they see fit, provided they do not infringe upon the rights of others. We hold these truths to be self-evident." Okay, so yeah.
Right. So I referenced the Declaration of Independence right there.
Mhm.
Um, says it right there, and that's one of the founding principles of the United States. Um, Natural rights being the idea that we are born with these rights, that they aren't given to us.
Mhm.
This is often a big area of disagreement um, uh, between some on the sort of Reaganite right, and many on both the left and the populist right. Um, in that the idea that, are we born with some sort of inherent rights, or does the government give them to us? and is, as we have laid out, as Thomas Jefferson laid out in the Declaration, is government um, instituted to protect those rights, or is it rather the case that we begin from the idea that we have government and then we move to the idea of rights?
Mhm.
And so I believe that I believe in God. I believe we are born with certain rights given to us by God, and that this stems from the fact that all of us are made in His image,
Mm.
and so that includes the right to our own lives. And so when I say um, you have liberty except when you infringe on other people's rights, meaning you don't have the right to go and kill somebody. You
Mhm.
don't have the right to enslave someone else, to take that person's freedom and to take their labor. You don't have the right to steal from someone to take their property. I would say it is a shorter list of rights than if we go and think of everything that the government could give to somebody.
Yeah.
Um, the list of rights that many progressives will come up with is a longer list. You know, by definition, if you're born with it, it's going to be a relatively short list. But I think they tend to be the many of the most important things in
Mhm.
life.
Yeah. The so morally right that human beings should own their own property and labor. When you say that, are you implying just that they can't be enslaved or shouldn't be robbed, or does it go beyond that too?
Um, yes, um, in the sense that I think that if let's see what's the best way to put it, that we often one difference between, say, once again, the left on the populist MAGA right on one side and the Reaganite right on the other would be the idea of um, does does the government, the state, have some sort of claim upon um, both the things that we own and our labor before um, we do? Is there some? Does the
Mm,
government have some sort of more fundamental claim that maybe they don't always, but at times they're going to say, "Well, you live in this society, you owe this," and so libertarians and others would say no, uh, no, there isn't. We do have a moral claim upon our own, the things which belong to us. And it isn't simply us being selfish to say, I want to own my own home, and to have a third amendment where we say that the government can't just come into my home.
mhm.
Um, that isn't just selfishness, that there's something in the dignity of individual human beings and of families that makes it right that we have this claim first. And then if the state is going to infringe upon that right, there has to be some sort of due process. So
Okay.
that's also in the Bill of Rights. That's also in our legal tradition, that in order for our rights to property and labor to be taken away, there has to be some sort of due process.
What are the implications for taxation?
For taxation, that I think taxes need to be um, just, and in that sense, that they should never be higher than they need to be.
Okay.
The purpose of the taxation is to raise revenue, so that the government can do the things that it is doing, and that it shouldn't be used to enrich anyone, um, and that it should be generally as low as possible in order for the government to still fund the things that it needs to do.
And so at a time like this when both political parties are running, when in charge, are running substantial deficits, annual deficits that add to the ever larger debt. Would I guess this is kind of a side question. What do you think of Doge
What do I think of Doge?
or Doge? Blah, blah.
I think that it was, there is something in the idea of it that I think is useful and could be good. I think the execution was extremely poor,
Mhm.
um, to the point where it may even end up with creating more waste than it gets rid of. Sure, everybody
Yeah.
everybody
Mhm.
on both sides is against waste, fraud, and abuse.
Sure.
Democrats talk about getting rid of waste, fraud, and abuse. Republicans talk about it too. The problem is there isn't enough waste, fraud, and abuse in the federal government to create all of the deficit. So, sure, it would be great to have serious, competent auditors go through and look at the Department of Defense. I support the troops and all of that. Believe that we should have a strong national defense. But the Department of Defense has not passed an audit in uh, I believe ever. Probably in the time of Eisenhower, it could have passed an audit, but in the modern era, um, the Department of Defense has never passed an audit. There is waste, fraud, and abuse there.
Mm.
However, Doge went about it so slipshod and haphazard that they end up firing random people, including they may fire good people who are doing their job, who are
Yeah.
trying to save money, and they may leave in place people who aren't doing their job. And so, no, I'm not a fan of Doge.
Yeah, that makes sense. I've thought, yeah. I mean, you're absolutely right. There's no one that is coming out like in support of waste, fraud, and abuse. And I think, if you took some amount that seems like a lot of money, but is really kind of a nominal sum when you're looking at what the government spends. You take 20 million, 30 million, or whatever, and you get a team of forensic accountants and you get some consultants and you get some lawyers. And you say, take 6 months. You guys are working around the clock and however much money, bill us, but come back with a set of recommendations, what we can get rid of. I think that's similar. I don't know exactly how they did it, but um, Gore led an initiative to do that during the Clinton administration, and they really actually cut a lot of jobs, and during that period, the government did end up balancing the budget. It's a kind
Yeah.
of complicated, but um, yeah, no, yeah, agreed. Okay, third point, or nope, yeah, third point. Ordered liberty. What does ordered liberty mean?
Yes. Order liberty means not anarchy. Means civilization.
Yeah, okay.
Um, Conservatism stems from the political philosopher and statesman Edmund Burke. Who was a Whig in the um, late 18th century, and uh, thought deeply about politics. And you'll read Burke and you'll see that he defends liberty, but then he tempers it and says, look, um, freedom is a good thing for human beings, but we need to exercise it wisely,
Mm,
and we need to be guided by some sense of what is right and wrong, um, and by a sense of duty to our country and to other people. And
yeah,
so, ordered liberty means rather than simply a it is meant to distinguish conservatism from libertarianism,
okay.
where many libertarians um, especially the libertarians who increasingly um, move towards anarchism and anarcho capitalism. Many of them say simply liberty, simply liberty. Anything anyone wants to do is okay. And the conservatives say, no, we don't want anarchy. We don't want um, uh, a state uh, a state of just complete disregard for other people. We need people to be free to do something good and to order their own lives and to build things together to have communities.
So that raises a couple of interesting points. So are you familiar with the concept of common good constitutionalism?
Yes, sure.
Okay. So well, I'll let you define it actually then if you would prefer.
Common good constitutionalism was created by Adrian Vermeule, a law professor at Harvard. It's a legal theory that challenges, originalism and textualism, which used to be from Robert Bork and Antonin Scalia were the defining legal theories of the political right. And common good constitutionalism um, is the idea that rather than simply following black letter law, judges should be free to um, color their decisions with their interpretations of natural law. And Vermeule is specifically thinking Catholic social teaching.
Yeah.
Um, what this amounts to in practice is often um, a mirror image of living constitutionalism on the left, where the
Mhm.
left says, "Look, we can't simply be bound by what older generations wrote down. You know, the world has changed so much since then. We need to have some flexibility for our judges to make decisions." And the common gooders um, like that, but would prefer that it be in a socially conservative direction.
Yeah, I think that is exactly that is exactly right. Very famous kind of living constitutionalist decisions would be, at least as decided. Not saying you couldn't reach a decision, even a similar decision, a different way, but this is how they were reached. But like Brown v. Board of Education, Roe v. Wade, there's some very notable cases from the mid 20th century. How, from your perspective, do you feel about these different legal theories?
I much prefer originalism and textualism.
Okay.
You know, I do think there are important criticisms of them,
Mhm.
um, but um, but no, I would be, you know, in the vein of originalism and textualism. You know, I do think common good constitutionalism is a serious mistake.
Okay. And do you think that, because you're talking about ordered liberty, and you want to have, there are going to be some rules and whatnot to encourage people to do good. Is the disagreement in who is setting those rules?
Yes,
Okay.
to some extent, yes. So I see a role for civil society,
Yeah.
and you can say that um, the difference between civil society and the state is that the state has the uh, power of coercion through violence, through force. They can make you follow rules,
Yep.
um, and I believe that we can't simply live in a society in which there are rules set by the state, and then other than that, everything else is good. You know, you need to have norms and traditions that build up over time within
Hmm.
communities, where we know, okay, this might not be legal, but there are right and wrong ways of acting. But also a major role um, for institutions that can be small, large, but that aren't the state, and that also aren't all businesses. They aren't all profit-seeking enterprises. You know, churches,
Hmm.
schools, charities. Various local civic organizations, but even things like clubs, fraternities, leagues,
Hmm.
places where people can gather together and they're voluntary. You often you're not required to join,
Yeah.
but they carry within them certain rules of order and expectations, and um, they shape us. They often teach us to be better people than we would be otherwise.
Yeah. And with those, for some of them, let's say schools, libraries, that sort of thing, do you think there's space for them to be publicly funded, or in an ideal world, would they be privately funded?
Um, I think it probably depends on the institution itself.
Okay.
I think in America, you're going to you know in both in the past and today, you're going to see a mix of the two. Um, I think that there are issues that come along with both. I
Mhm.
do tend to prefer privately funded institutions, uh, but the also you're going to have different communities will be different. You know, one of the great things about this country is that we do have a great diversity of communities across across the land, and people in different communities will live in different ways, and
Mm,
some would choose to have um, more, privately run organizations, and others would say, no, we do want to have more public funding for whether it's libraries would be a good example where there are public libraries, and there are also libraries that are primarily um, established through charitable giving.
yeah. Okay. Yeah. So, um, had this discussion with libertarians before. So to continue the library example just briefly, uh, the alternative to a public library to you is not like a library run for profit necessarily, but a library established through through a trust or something by someone, uh, someone or some collection of people donate money to run it.
Both. I'd say both.
Okay, okay, got it. Okay, next up, limited government. What and why limit the government?
Sure. So limited government is not simply the idea that government should be small. It's that there should be limitations on power.
Mm,
Um, it's that rather than a society in which anything and everything that the state wants to do, the state can do, that the idea of limited government is this is a dangerous society, a society in which the government has total free reign, is a society which tends towards tyranny over time. And
hmm.
so, limited government are the limitations on power. Um, and it isn't simply a matter of having sort of rules against, okay, the government can't, um, you know, make you a slave, but also having a system in that as a function of the system limits power itself. So the classic example being the um, three branches of American government divide both divides the powers, separation of powers, also divides the functions into three different areas,
Hmm.
and the branches work together and against each other, and you know um, often in productive ways, sometimes in not productive ways, but the damage that can potentially be done is limited by the fact that there is this separation.
Ooh, there's a lot here. Okay, so over the last kind of a lot of years now, although we are, if not seeing an acceleration now, we're seeing the functional end of some process. But Congress has delegated a substantial chunk of its legislative power to the president, to the executive branch. There are limits to that delegation, which kind of it's like it has delegated a neutered version of that power, but has delegated a lot. And now what we're seeing. This is President Trump very much does this, but it's certainly not only him. But we see a lot of governing through executive order because that is functionally the only way that things are going to get done. And then new president comes in, and we reverse everything. And do you have a general reaction to that? How do you feel about that?
Yeah, so I agree with entirely with that description, and I think it's a problem. I think it's a source of a lot of the dysfunction in our society, um, and I certainly don't have all the answers for how do we get Congress to do its job and to take back some of the power that it has delegated. But we're not going to get um, lasting solutions to some of our most pressing problems simply by this current status quo. Congress could have solved immigration 20 years ago. Um, and
Yeah.
if they don't, then instead we're going to get what we have now, where every president comes in and does something different with regards to enforcement. And there are overreaches in both directions, and nobody's
Hmm.
happy.
Let me so Seth, another one of your points is, and this I'm gonna ask some questions about this and pick not because I don't love America, but because I want to hear your answers. American constitutionalism. The U.S. Constitution established the greatest form of government the world has ever known. and to this day remains the Constitution remains the most important document in American politics. The activities of the Congress and the president must be governed by the Constitution. Judges should be guided by original intent, originalism, text, textualism, and tradition when issuing rulings. Okay, so U.S. Constitution established the greatest form of government the world has ever known. Okay, why? What makes you believe that?
Sure. So, what I would say is not that the U.S. Constitution is perfect,
Hmm.
but that if you look at the track record of human history, um, most of the ways human beings have chosen to govern themselves have had serious downsides, and a handful have been good and have worked
Hmm.
quite well. Um, and of those, ours has worked better than any of the others. Not that there haven't been problems. Obviously, I think that especially the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, but many other amendments were necessary. Um, but one of the virtues of our system is that the Constitution contained within it a mechanism we can use to amend it. Um,
Hmm.
People say, well, it's too difficult to amend the Constitution. I think it's actually a good thing that it's difficult, because I do think that for major changes to the Constitution, the structure of government, they should be considered, and they should take some time, and they need to have a broad based consensus behind them. Um, Not something that a party with a 55% majority could implement overnight. Um, so, our system, I think it's more stable than typically most democracies or most republics. Um, Most free societies tend towards a parliamentary model. We have
Hmm.
a presidential system. And one problem with the parliamentary model is that it is less stable. It is easier for a coup to happen in a parliamentary model, um, as we have seen with the track record of um, European countries that had parliamentary systems, and other countries around the world that had these systems that were um, proved unstable.
So that's an interesting point you raised right there. So parliamentary system, yeah, I think definitionally is more flexible, which would I think could certainly lead to less stability, or would tend to less stability. Um, but there are advantages, I think, or I'd like to hear your reaction to my saying there are advantages or potential advantages to a parliamentary system where, like, I think we're seeing some of the downsides in the American system now, where Congress really they do have a very difficult time getting things done, and because they have such a difficult time getting things done, they've delegated more and more power to the executive branch. The irony being that in America, we did not want a king. We didn't want this kind of not just a powerful executive, but a hereditary executive. And then over time, the two governments have kind of changed. Where in the UK, the king has virtually no power, at least compared to the president. And here in the U.S., we're doing more and more through just the president. Do you have a general reaction to that?
Yes, which is that I agree with that. I think two things come to mind. One is that yes, the flexibility in the parliamentary system is both a virtue and a defect. In my case,
Mm,
being conservative, I tend to worry more about stability and tyranny,
mm,
and other people tend to worry more about, but we need to get stuff done. And
mhm,
I tend to see the world more in terms of, sometimes we have to live with some problems and preserve the good things we have, rather than remove those barriers to getting things done, which can then also um, remove barriers for potential bad actors to do something even worse. But in the case of um, Congress today and the executive, uh, part of it I think is technology. Part of it I
mm,
think is Congress, um, is members of Congress. Um, this is actually what they want. They, not all of them. Certainly, there are many who, but the ones we often see on television and um, who make noise on social media. They like the status quo this way. It benefits them. But the other thing I'll say is that I don't think the fault is our system. I think the system is representing us very well, and it's giving us what we collectively have decided we want.
Mm,
And um, the unfortunate truth is that this is this is in some ways what we want. It's not what any of us individually want,
yeah.
but I would say, unfortunately, most Americans do tend to think of the president as not a king, but
Mm,
sort of like a king. That's the person in charge. What they do is important,
mhm,
and what they say matters, and we're supposed to do what that person says.
yeah.
I think also um, the dysfunction of Congress reflects that we uh, not all of us, but we collectively have tended to vote for people who get attention, for
Yeah.
people who, um, have a lot of emotion and generate controversy, whereas the boring politicians who are just in there to do their job and work hard, whose names we never know, they don't tend to do as well in elections.
Yeah. It's funny. I that the last interview I conducted chronologically is the last one released, and then got a couple others that are coming out, and then we'll have this one that listeners will be able to listen to. But the it was Ben McAdams, who served in Congress. He was a representative, a Democrat from Utah, represented Utah's fourth district in Congress from is the back half of President Trump's first term, and he does not come off as a politician. He's a really bright guy, really kind, really personable, and I think the reason he was able to win in a heavily gerrymandered R+19 district is that because of his previous service as Salt Lake County mayor, he was then the county mayor. And he had high name recognition, so which I think helped, and then he also had this very strong record for bipartisanship and reaching across the aisle, and really he was he's a pragmatic guy. And so that was enough to get him to Congress for a term. But, he's in such a heavily gerrymandered district. It was basically impossible to hold the seat. And I don't know where I'm going with that other than that it's a shame that we don't have more people like him, I
Mhm.
think, in Congress on both sides. People that are really there to get things done and can get things done.
I agree.
Uh, um, you have a couple of other points here that I think are particularly salient now, and since we've been talking for a while, maybe we'll just do a couple more, and then I want to get your thoughts on the Trump administration, um, and Biden. American leadership abroad. Okay, so you a couple of things you say. American hegemony, primacy on the high seas, a unipolar world should be the goal of American foreign policy. American hegemony is in America's interests, both national security and trade, and the world's interests because it establishes incentives for other nations to cooperate. What do you mean, and what do you think is the best way of going about achieving that?
Sure. I don't mean that I think we should colonize other countries or tell them what to do.
Okay.
Um, I do think when something seriously wrong is going on, there might be a case that we need to intervene. I think we need to be careful about how we do that. Um, Primacy on the high seas. Um, that's the idea that essentially our Navy, and I say increasingly today in cooperation with some of our allies, um, but we already do this and we do it in cooperation with them, and it's very clear who the leader is. Um, we guarantee freedom of navigation. We guarantee that um, people can trade and protect essentially the world against piracy.
Mm,
This is what the British Navy did essentially until it was us for the 19th century, and that's been um, you know wholly good for the human race. The earlier eras in which piracy and in internal trade, robbers. Um, it was very dangerous time, and it tended to not work out very well for the least well off, the most disadvantaged societies. The other
Yeah.
thing is that um, with us being um, very clearly powerful, we can sort of deter wars from happening. And a perfect example of this would be India and Pakistan just recently.
Mm.
We're starting to go at it. And um, now, it wasn't simply us, it was also the fact that both of those countries have nuclear weapons and are very worried about getting into a nuclear war with each other.
Yeah.
But you can look at other examples too, where um, there will be a dust up where some, say in the South China Sea, um, one country, you know, um, uh, accidentally or on purpose kills some fishermen from another country, and we can sort of go and say, hey, um, it's in neither of your interests to get into a war. And so we do provide some stability for the world in that way. Um, and one thing I would say is that uh, it's not that America is perfect, but that our time as the preeminent world superpower has been better for the world than the reign of other preeminent superpowers, that we have largely been good for other nations, not always.
Mhm.
And also that if you look around the world, when people say either that we're going to have a multipolar world, which we're sort of living in today, or that we're going to have a different country be the preeminent superpower, all the candidates who would potentially replace us or challenge our status are bad actors.
Mm.
China would be the obvious one. There really isn't another one right now. Russia is not in the position that China is in. And if you look, China's done a lot of terrible things. I think that, um, I think what's going on in with the Uyghurs is very bad. I think in 20 or 30 years, we will discover that it was a lot worse
Mm.
than we really know today.
Mhm.
And China is a bully to the other nations in its region, um, and it has been more of a force for bad on the world stage.
Yeah. What if you had to name, let's say, it's going to sound like a funny question potentially, but who are our most important allies?
Who are our most important allies? Um, the United Kingdom would be one, not necessarily because of their position, but because of our historic friendship with them.
Mhm.
Um, to be honest, probably even more important would be Canada. Our northern neighbor who
Yeah.
has been more loyal to us than anyone else,
Yeah.
and also the in the history of the human race, the longest undefended border. Um, we don't have troops there. They don't. Both of us know that we have shared interests and that neither of us is going to try to invade the other. And sadly,
Yeah.
perhaps some of that's been thrown into question recently. But yeah,
Yeah.
Canada would be one of our most important allies.
Yeah.
Um, Japan is a very important ally.
Mm.
Um, Australia, South Korea, other European nations are also important allies of ours. As India develops, I think it's going to be important to maintain an alliance with India.
Mm.
That said, India likes to um, keep their options open, and they um, are sort of would prefer to neither be entirely our allies nor entirely be, say, Russia's ally.
Mm.
Um, they like to keep their options open. The other important ally, I would say, and is Israel.
Mhm.
I think that uh, both from the sense that I do think the world owes the Jewish people um, a safe homeland after the Holocaust and after centuries of uh, persecution, and also that uh, the Middle East is still an important region for
Mhm.
us. and Israel has been a loyal ally for us there.
What would you I mean, obviously, right now, that's a serious that's a contentious issue because of
Right.
the way that, um because of a lot of things, but including the way that Israel is conducting operations in Gaza. Uh, and I think it was today or yesterday that Britain, Canada, and France came out with a statement denouncing, despite supporting Israel, remaining strong allies, denouncing the way that they are conducting the latest offensive. Um, what do you think the United States' posture should be with respect to Israel at this point?
Sure. So um, I tend to think I, you know, I I tend to think that we should, in fact, be willing to provide them with weapons, and I do think that um, we need to defend them on the world stage, including when there are votes in the United Nations that go against them. Which isn't to say that everything Israel ever does is good or correct, um, but that we have to recognize that I have criticisms of some actions Israel has taken, but we do have to recognize that there is a um, very sizable around the world, and even in this country, but especially around the world, um, uh, camp of outright enemies who are always going to act in bad faith for the reason that it is a Jewish state,
Hmm.
um, and that not all of the criticism of Israel is unfair. There is a lot that is motivated by anti-Semitism, and that includes. I'm not necessarily going to. I don't think that that includes say Britain and Canada, but it does include say some of the resolutions that get passed in the United Nations. I do think anti-Semitism plays a role in
Hmm.
that.
Interesting. Wait, I last question on that. I apologize, kind of putting you on the spot on this one. Um, the Trump administration has taken a strong approach in combating anti-Semitism. Became something of an issue in the campaign, but then they've adopted. I'm going to get the names wrong, so I'm not going to try. But they've adopted a new definition of anti-Semitism and enshrined it into certain aspects of federal law. And this is sort of thing that can be used, as I understand it, to um, potentially go after college students. Um, how does that square with your view of ordered liberty and limited government?
Right. I would say it's a mixed bag. I would say that there, I don't support every aspect of the Trump administration's execution of, um, this particular stance. At the same time, I do think there was a real problem that they are addressing.
Got it. Okay. Let's let me just do let me do two last ones. There's a lot and they're so good. But I want to do tradition and the pace of change and then virtue. Okay. So first, tradition and the pace of change. What you write is it is quicker to destroy than it is to build. The customs, technologies, institutions, and rules which have survived the longest are the most robust and the most likely to continue to be useful in the future. Newer technologies and newer rules become obsolete more quickly. So, those are some strong claims. Defend them.
Sure. So the second point there is what I'm referencing is the Lindy effect.
Okay.
Um, the Lindy effect being that specifically with regards to technology, that simpler technologies that have been around longer, um, anything that has been able to survive for a long period of time has been tested, and that something that is new is untested. And it may in fact be better, but we on the whole should hedge against new things surviving as long um, as that which has been around. And
Mm,
so it's sort of a going back to Edmund Burke, a, a skeptical posture towards change was not saying no change. Not that
yeah.
we should never change. There are a lot of new things that are good. Obviously, there has been some um, you know good changes throughout human history, but we need to be careful about change, um, and we need to understand that that if too much change too quickly can result um, in worse outcomes. The classic example that Burke was talking about was the French Revolution,
Mm,
and often remains a salient example where more limited changes over a longer period of time um, can result in something that a better situation without the horrific bloodshed and whatnot. The other principle that's in there is um, what's often known as Chesterton's fence.
yeah,
G.K. Chesterton, commonly referenced by conservatives, who said that if you're a reformer, you should, and you come, you are as if a man comes to a fence in the middle of a field, and um, the naive reformer says, "Well, I don't know why this is here at all. Let's just get rid of it." And the wise reformer says, "First, you have to come and or go and find out why the fence is there, and then when you know why it's there, then you can go and come back to me and say we should remove it." Um, and just the what's embodied there is the principle that um, you really need to understand what you're doing and not assume that everything that came before you is um, suspect, but that there were wise people before you who put something in place. And
yeah,
maybe if it's lasted a long time, there's a reason for that. You should respect that, which isn't to say that you might discover that the reason no longer is valid, and maybe we are going to make a change, but you should understand that before making the change.
yeah. I actually wrote an article about Doge and Chesterton's fence. So nice. One question. So the French Revolution does remain a classic example of change done a little bit too fast. That didn't go super well. Um, but that came shortly on the heels of the American Revolution, which I don't I have never personally characterized as an incremental event. There was a lot that happened pretty quick. How do you distinguish the two other than just one went really well and one went less well?
I would say actually a lot of conservatives do distinguish them, including Burke,
Mm,
as the conservative revolution being a more um, limited and pragmatic and even conservative revolution. Um, the rather than having the radicalism of the terror and of the guillotine, you
yeah.
know, the Patriots, the American side, the colonist side, were generally not committing atrocities against what were called Tories, royalists. Um, sure, there were, in any war, if you look at the actual history, there were bad things done by British soldiers against civilians. There were bad things that um, colonist civilians did to other, but on the whole, it was a more civilized war. But then the other point was that um, it was viewed as there was this tradition or continuity which is being preserved. There was this sense that um, the colonists are saying, no, we're Englishmen, and
Mm,
the king has violated our rights as Englishmen. We They didn't understand themselves to be doing something wholly um, wholly novel. The French famously wanted to restart at year zero,
mm,
begin everything again. They were going to throw out all the rules, including in odd ways, with how they're going to divide up France into, geographical areas and the names of the months. And, the colonists are saying, um, we have unfortunately been brought to the point at which we have to sever ourselves from England.
mhm.
But they saw that as, because we are defending our rights as Englishmen and defending the liberty which has been our birthright.
Yeah. Okay. Nice. I asked the question ignorantly. I frankly don't know that much about the French Revolution, so I'm just going to take everything you said as absolute gospel. Um, Last one: virtue, character, and public morality are not sideshows. A corrupt culture cannot support sound government. Virtue begins at home and cannot be imposed from the top down.
Yeah, so that's there's a lot there. The last line is a dig at the new right, and many of the nationalists
Mm,
who do believe that we need laws that are enforcing a particular um, mode of life. That without that, then we just have all the terrible things that they don't like. And I'm saying, no, you can't just by imposing a blasphemy law cause people to clean up their language. Um, and then the other part, at the beginning, character and public morality. It is a bit of a dig at Donald Trump. He's, I would say, cause and effect. Um, you know, it was not simply him. It's not just about him, but he would be the most prominent example, by no means the only example, of a politician who is entirely lacking in good character, his conduct, his lack of decency, everything from cheating on his wife with a porn star when his wife is nursing a 4 month old, um, to the way in which, to the corruption, the Qatari jet or the crypto nonsense, um, but also to the way in which he talks about um, the other side as being enemies of the people and they aren't real Americans. Our side are the real Americans, according to Trump. Um, and anyone who opposes him is de facto a bad person. And I would say that um, we used to laugh, and I have my criticisms of the moral majority or the
mm,
um, you know 1990s sort of scolding era of conservatism. Um, but and there was this sense that, oh, come on guys, do you really um, you know does this stuff really matter? Can't you lighten up a bit? And some of that's fair, but I think we need to take seriously the idea that character does matter in our leaders,
mhm.
and it matters in us too. We can't just live um, sort of just terrible lives and then say, "Oh, but our leaders, the people we elect, they have to be paragons of virtue." Um, and I would say it's a dig at the right for so many of the people who were those crusaders in the moral majority became Trump's biggest defenders. Whether it was um, Bill Bennett, who wrote the Children's Book of Virtues, and then became this MAGA guy who was saying things like, "Oh, so he uses foul language. What do you really care?" And it was like, well, we care that you're a hypocrite.
Yeah. The yeah. So it's yeah, that's interesting. Hey, let me yeah. I mean, as someone it was I agree with everything you're saying, and it's very easy for me to agree with everything you're saying because, I didn't start this whole process as a Republican. So, like when he comes in, for everyone on the left, it's like, oh, what an absolute outrage. And so I want you to like what are your thoughts on Biden? This has been an interesting couple of weeks, interesting couple of years, but the more information we get about his the deterioration of his health in office, maybe even before he held office. Um, where do you think Democrats and progressives stand on the moral front at this point?
Um, so I mean, on that question, I do think that first of all, it's very sad. It's sad for his family, um, but I do think it does implicate the Democratic Party, not in the same way, and certainly not all Democrats. Dean Phillips ran against him because he says Biden is too old. But
Yeah.
those two were actively covering up Biden's deteriorating health when it was obvious that he could not have remained president for another 4 years. Um, that does implicate, their character, and it does say, you were one, you were lying to the American people. Two, it is just the spotlight has been destructive to Biden and his family.
Yeah.
It's very sad spectacle, the whole thing. But they bear responsibility too. I mean, uh, nobody was forcing him to run again.
No.
No one was forcing him to pretend that he still had it. I think he sincerely thinks that he still has it. Um, but when you are in a position of responsibility, whether it's the presidency or any position of leadership, you have to recognize that your job is not to put your own interests first, but to put the interests of the institutions, in this case, the country, first.
Yeah.
And so it is the responsibility of a president of good character to determine and to work hard to determine, can they continue to fulfill the duties of the office, and if they can't, they do need to step aside so that someone else can.
Yeah, man. Yeah. Let me get so we're I'm going to ask you one last question, although it won't be a super quick answer. But setting aside questions of morality, except as they implicate uh, maybe existing law, I want you to give me, your 1, 3, 5, however many, what you think are the most significant deviations from traditional conservatism that we're seeing from the Donald Trump era of the Republican Party.
Sure. So the two major differences between, say, um, the populists, the nationalists, the new right, and the more traditional Republican Party, the two major areas would be on economics and foreign policy. Um, the foreign policy, you see the rise of the restrainers. They're sometimes called isolationists. They aren't really isolationists. The more Jacksonian foreign policy, these are the folks who want to abandon Ukraine,
Mm,
um, and in some cases want to abandon Israel, and in some cases just want to abandon all our allies and all our alliances. And um, many of them are upset and angry over the Iraq and Afghanistan wars.
mm,
Um, and in some cases, they have other motivations. I do think that in the case of Ukraine and Russia, it's very clearly that um, Trump has always admired Vladimir Putin. He's still upset over that perfect phone call with Zelensky that got him the first impeachment. And
mhm,
many of his followers do simply hold the enemy of my enemy is my friend view of the world.
mm,
So that would be one deviation, would be on foreign policy. And sort of it goes to a belief that, one, they no longer really believe in America. They do believe that we're not necessarily a good actor on the foreign stage, but also that we're in decline. And to
mm,
be honest, in at least some cases, I think they're rooting for the decline. They like the
hmm,
idea that we're a power in decline. And then on economics, um, across the populist, nationalist, new right, you have a spectrum, but certainly they see themselves as arrayed against free markets, free enterprise. Some of them will give lip service and are, sure, they don't like free trade. They'll have some tariffs. They like industrial policy. But then there are others who are, in fact, sympathetic to socialism, to Marxism. I think it's not outside of elite intellectual circles. Um, it's not very well known, but there is a pretty solid contingent of folks who are, um, you know, progressive to even socialist in their economic views, but
hmm,
very traditionalist in their whether in their religious views, and so
yeah,
they don't like gay marriage. They don't like abortion. They would, on social issues, be considered very conservative. Um, but in some ways, many of them like Marx. They like the Frankfurt School. They like critical theory. Um, It's just the social side of things that they don't like the Democrats on.
Do you have can you think of an example of a specific person who would, fall in
Sure,
that
Patrick
category?
Deneen would be an example.
Mm.
I
Notre
don't
Dame
know that
professor?
I wouldn't
Yeah.
I don't know that Patrick Deneen is a Marxist, but certainly on economics, he's probably around where Elizabeth Warren is. He agrees with Elizabeth Warren on a lot of things
Okay.
on economics. Um, I would say Compact Magazine is a good example where they will publish articles defending critical theory, um, and defending various Marxists.
Mhm.
Um, but they actually another great example, and he does not consider himself. He's not active in politics. Rather, he's getting up there in years. But the philosopher Alistair McIntyre, who
Hmm.
was a Marxist and was involved in Marxist organizations, famously wrote the book After Virtue. There are a lot of folks on the new right who really like After Virtue, and
Yeah.
McIntyre was he was a red Tory when he was in the sense that um, a lot of the social side of Toryism he liked, but he was a red.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Very, very, yeah, interesting. It's an interesting period. I had to look him up. His name sounds like someone else I was familiar with, but I was actually not familiar with him. It's. I like interviewing people who are better read than me. This is this is a lot of fun. Get to learn a lot. Um, that okay. Very interesting. I think we're okay. Ending here. Do you have any closing thoughts? Any last sell you want to make for traditional conservatism?
no, I think we've hit the high points.
We've given it a fair, yeah,
Yes,
fair
yeah.
hearing. Good.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, and that was the interview. Thank you very much for listening. If you wouldn't mind, please do leave a review for the podcast. I believe those are important. And subscribe to the newsletter, which will be linked in the show notes or can be found at neverclosetheinquiry.substack.com. Thanks.